Hello, 8th graders. All right, there was a request for a video reading of chapter 11 of Unbroken, so you'll have to get ready for teacher in running clothes. You can see a little tour of my house as you're sitting here, and I'm sure you will all be shocked to know that I'm reading this with a cup of tea, which does say, "Go away, I'm reading." So on that note, let's get started. If you're following along, we're on Unbroken chapter 11, which starts on page 119. This chapter is called Nobody's Going to Live Through This. And you might remember that in chapter 10, Louis was bombed. The atoll that they were on, that island, was bombed, and so we're kind of starting it the next morning. So here we go, page 119. On Thursday, May 27th, 1943, Louis rose at 5 a.m. Everyone else in the cottage was asleep. He tiptoed out and hiked up the hill behind the cottage to rouse himself, then walked back, pulled on his workout clothes, and started for the runway. On his way, he found a sergeant and asked him to pace him in a jeep. The sergeant agreed, and Louis jogged off with the jeep beside him. He turned a mile in 4:12, a dazzling time given that he was running in sand. He was in the best shape of his life. So remember, before the war started, Louis was in the Olympics, so he's still really fast. He's not training, but he's, still running. He walked back to the cottage, cleaned himself up, and dressed, donning a pair of tropical weight khaki pants, a t-shirt, and a muslin-top shirt that he'd bought in Honolulu. After breakfast, and some time spent fixing up his new room, he wrote a letter to Peyton Jordan, tucked the letter into his shirt pocket, climbed into a borrowed car with Phil and Cuppernell, and headed for Honolulu. At the base gate, they were flagged down by the despised lieutenant who had ordered them to fly Superman on 3 engines. The lieutenant was on urgent business. Clarence Corpening's B-24, which had left for Canton the day before, had never landed. The lieutenant, who was under the impression that the plane was a B-25 instead of a much larger B-24, was looking for volunteers to hunt for it. Phil told him that they had no plane. The lieutenant said they could take Green Hornet. When Phil said that the plane wasn't airworthy, the lieutenant replied that it had passed inspection. Both Louis and Phil knew that though the word volunteer was used, this was an order. Phil volunteered. The lieutenant woke pilot Joe Deasy and talked him into volunteering as well. Deasy and his crew would take the B-24 Daisy May. Phil, Lou, and Cuppernell turned back to round up their crew. Stopping at the cottage, Louis grabbed a pair of binoculars that he had bought at the Olympics. He flipped open his diary and jotted down a few words on what he was about to do. There was only one ship, the Green Hornet, a musher, he wrote. We were reluctant, but Phillips finally gave in for rescue mission. Just before he left, Louis scribbled a note and left it on his footlocker in which he kept his liquor-filled condiment jars. If we're not back in a week, it read, help yourself to the booze. Louis, per usual, is getting into trouble on base, and you can see here that there's a diary entry from Louis from right before they went on this flight, so check that out in your book. The lieutenant met the crews at Green Hornet. He unrolled a map. He believed that Corpening had gone down 200 miles north of Palmyra. His reason for believing this is unclear. The official report of the downing states that the plane wasn't seen or heard from after takeoff, so it could have been anywhere. Whatever his reason, he told Phil to follow a heading of 208 and search to a point called point parallel to Palmyra. He gave Deasy roughly the same instructions, but directed him to a slightly different area. Both crews were told to search all day, land at Palmyra, then resume searching the next day if necessary. Remember that these B-24s had been having a bunch of problems, and so planes going down, unfortunately, wasn't that uncommon, so they're going to search for this crashed plane. As they prepared for takeoff, everyone on Phil's crew worried about Green Hornet. Louis tried to reassure himself that without bombs or ammunition aboard, the plane should have enough power to stay airborne. Phil was concerned that he'd never been in this plane and didn't know its quirks. He knew that it had been cannibalized, and he hoped the critical parts weren't missing. You might remember from the earlier chapter that they started taking parts from this plane to help other planes because they didn't think it was worthy of being flown. And so now here's Louis and Phil stuck with this plane with leftover parts. The crew reviewed crash procedures and made a special inspection to be sure that the survival equipment was aboard. There was a provisions box in the plane, and retrieving this was the tail gunner's responsibility. There was also an extra raft stored in a yellow bag on the flight deck. This raft was Louis's responsibility, and he checked to be sure it was there. He put on his Mae West, as did some of the other crewmen. Phil left his off, perhaps because it was difficult to fly with it on. At the last moment, an enlisted man ran to the plane and asked if he could hitch a ride to Palmyra. There were no objections, and the man found a seat in the back. With the addition of the enlisted man, there were 11 on board. As Phil and Cuppernell turned the plane to the taxiway, Louis remembered his letter to Peyton Jordan. He fished it from his pocket, leaned from the waist window, and tossed it to a ground crewman who said he'd mail it for him. Daisy Mae lifted off at almost the same time as Green Hornet, and the planes flew side by side. On Green Hornet, other than the 4 Superman veterans, the crewmen were strangers and had little to say to one another. Louis passed the time on the flight deck chatting with Phil and Cuppernell. Green Hornet, true to form, flew with its tail well below its nose and couldn't keep up with Daisy Mae. After about 200 miles, Phil radioed to Daisy to go on without him. The crews lost sight of each other. Sometime around 2 p.m., Green Hornet reached the search area, about 225 miles north of Palmyra. Clouds pressed around the plane, and no one could see the water. Phil dropped the plane under the clouds, leveling off at 800 feet. Louis took out his binoculars, descended to the greenhouse, and began scanning. Phil's voice soon crackled over the interphone, asking him to come up and pass the binoculars around. Louis did as told, then remained on the flight deck just behind Phil and Cuppernell. While they searched the ocean, Cuppernell asked Phil if he could switch seats with him, taking over the first pilot's duties. This was a common practice, enabling co-pilots to gain experience to qualify as first pilots. Phil assented. The enormous Cuppernell squeezed around Phil and into the left seat as Phil moved to the right. Cuppernell began steering the plane. A few minutes later, someone noticed that the engines on one side were burning more fuel than those on the other, making one side progressively lighter. They began transferring fuel across the wings to even out the load. Suddenly, there was a shudder. Louis looked at the tachometer and saw that the RPMs on the engine number 1 on the far left were falling. He looked out the window. The engine was shaking violently, then it stopped. The bomber tipped left and began dropping rapidly toward the ocean. Phil and Cuppernell had only seconds to save the plane. They began working rapidly, but Louis had the sense that they were disoriented by their seat swap. To minimize drag from the dead number 1 engine, they needed to feather it, turn the dead propeller blades parallel to the wind, and stop the propeller's rotation. Normally, this was Cuppernell's job, but now he was in the pilot's seat. As he worked, Cuppernell shouted to the new engineer to come to the cockpit to feather the engine. It's unknown if he or anyone else specified which engine needed feathering. It was a critical piece of information because a dead engine's propeller continues turning in the wind. It can look just like a running engine. We're on page 123 if you're following along. On the control panel, there were 4 feathering buttons, one for each engine, covered by a plastic shield. Leaning between Cuppernell and Phil, the engineer flipped the shield and banged down on a button. The moment he did it, Green Hornet heaved and lurched left. The engineer had hit the number 2 button, not the number 1 button. Both leftward engines were now dead, and number 1 still wasn't feathered. Phil pushed the 2 working engines full on, trying to keep the plane aloft long enough to restart the good left engine. The racing right engines, pulling against the dragging liftless side, rolled the plane halfway onto its left side, sending it into a spiral. The engine wouldn't start. The plane kept dropping. Green Hornet was doomed. The best Phil could do was try to level it out to ditch. He grunted 3 words into the interphone: "Prepare to crash." Louis ran from the flight deck, yelling for everyone to get to crash stations. As the plane whirled, he dug out the extra life raft, then clambered toward his crash position by the right waist window. He saw Mac, the new tail gunner, clutching the survival provisions box. Other men were frantically pulling on Mae Wests. Those would be their life vests. Louis was distantly aware that Mitchell hadn't emerged from the nose. It was Mitchell's duty to calculate the plane's position, relay this to the radioman so he could send a distress signal, and strap the sextant and celestial navigation kit to his body. But with the plane gyrating down nose first and the escape passage narrow, perhaps the navigator couldn't pull himself out. So it's Mitchell's job to alert back to the base where their plane is when it crashes, so they'll be able to be found. As the men behind the cockpit fled toward the comparative safety of the waist and rear of the plane, one man, on page 124, almost certainly the engineer who had hit the wrong feathering button, apparently stayed in front. Because life rafts didn't deploy automatically in a crash, it was the engineer's duty to stand behind the cockpit to pull the overhead raft release handle. To ensure that the rafts would be near enough to the plane for survivors to swim to them, he would have to wait until just before the crash to pull the handle. This meant he would have little or no chance to get to crash position, and thus little chance of survival. Phil and Cuppernell fought the plane. Green Hornet rolled onto its left side, moving faster and faster as the right engines thundered at full power. There was no time to radio a distress call. Phil looked for a swell over which to orient the plane for ditching, but it was no use. He couldn't haul the plane level, and even if he'd been able to, he was going much too fast. They were going to crash very hard. Phil felt strangely devoid of fear. He watched the water rotating up at him and thought, "There's nothing more I can do." Louis sat down on the floor by the bulkhead, facing forward. There were 5 men near him. Everyone looked stunned. No one said anything. Louis looked out the right waist window. All he saw was the cloudy sky turning around and around. He felt intensely alive. He recalled the bulkhead in front of him and thought of how his skull would strike it. Sensing the ocean coming up at the plane, he took a last glance at the twisting sky, then pulled the life raft in front of him and pushed his head into his chest. One terrible tumbling second passed, then another. An instant before the plane struck the water, Louis's mind throbbed with a single final thought. Nobody's going to live through this, which is the title of our chapter. On page 124 and 125, there's a picture of the Green Hornet before it crashed, just so you can see what we're talking about here. It continues on page 125. For Louis, there were only jagged, soundless sensations. His body capitulated or was thrown forward, the plane breaking open, something wrapping itself around him, the cold slap of water, and then its weight over him. Green Hornet, its nose and left wing hitting first at high speed, stabbed into the ocean and blew apart. As the plane disintegrated around him, Louis felt himself being pulled deep underwater. Then abruptly, the downward motion stopped and Louis was flung upward. The force of the plane's plunge had spun itself and the fuselage, so all the exploded bits, momentarily buoyed by the air trapped inside, leapt to the surface. Louis opened his mouth and gasped. The air hissed from the plane and the water rushed up over Louis again. The plane slipped under and sank toward the ocean floor as if yanked downward. Louis tried to orient himself. The tail was no longer behind him, the wings no longer ahead. The men who'd been around him were gone. The impact had rammed him into the waist gun mount and wedged him under it, face down, with the raft below him. The gun mount pressed against his neck, and countless strands of something were coiled around his body, binding him to the gun mount and the raft. He felt them and thought, spaghetti. It was a snarl of wires, Green Hornet's nervous system. When the tail had broken off, the wires had snapped and whipped around him. He thrashed against them but couldn't get free. He felt frantic to breathe, but couldn't. So they've crashed. They're in the water, and Louis is being dragged down by all of the parts of the plane that have crashed on top of them. In the remains of the cockpit, Phil was fighting to get out. Top of 126. When the plane hit, he was thrown forward, his head striking something. A wave of water punched through the cockpit, and the plane carried him under. From the darkness, he knew that he was far below the surface, sinking deeper by the second. He apparently saw Cuppernell push his big body out of the plane. Phil found what he thought was the cockpit window frame, its glass missing. He put his foot on something hard and pushed himself through the opening and out of the cockpit. He swam toward the surface, the light coming up around him. He emerged in a puzzle of debris. His head was gushing blood, and his ankle and one finger were broken. He found a floating hunk of wreckage, perhaps 4 feet square, and clung to it. It began to sink. There were 2 life rafts far away. No one was in them. Cuppernell was nowhere to be seen. Far below, Louis was still ensnared in the plane, writhing in the wires. He looked up and saw a body, drifting passively. The plane coursed down, and the world fled away above. Louis felt his ears pop, and vaguely recollected that at a swimming pool at Redondo Beach, his ears would pop at 20 feet. Darkness enfolded him, and the water pressure bore in with greater and greater intensity. He struggled uselessly. He thought, hopeless. He was being dragged down into the water, and he knows he's about to drown. His ears are popping. He can't breathe. He felt a sudden, excruciating bolt of pain in his forehead. There was an oncoming stupor, a fading as he tore at the wires and clenched his throat against the need to breathe. He had the soft realization that this was the last of everything. He passed out. He woke in total darkness. He thought, this is death. Then he found the water still on him, the heavy dropping weight of the plane around him. Inexplicably, the wires were gone, as was the raft. He was floating inside the fuselage, which was bearing him toward the ocean floor, some 1,700 feet down. He could see nothing. His Mae West was still uninsulated, but its buoyancy was pulling him into the ceiling of the plane. The air was gone from his lungs, and he was now gulping, reflexively swallowing salt water. He tasted blood, gasoline, and oil. He was drowning. Louis flung out his arms, trying to find a way out. His right hand struck something, and his USC ring snagged on it. His hand was caught. He reached toward it with his left hand and felt a long, smooth length of metal. The sensation oriented him. He was at the open right waist window. He swam into the window, put his feet on the frame, and pushed off, wrenching his right hand free and cutting his finger. His back struck the top of the window, and the skin under his shirt scraped off. He kicked clear. The plane sank away. Louis fumbled for the cords on his Mae West, hoping that no one had poached the carbon dioxide canisters. Luck was with him. The chambers ballooned. He was suddenly light, the vest pulling him urgently upward in a stream of debris. He burst into dazzling daylight. He gasped in a breath and immediately vomited up the salt water and fuel he had swallowed. He had survived. And on that note, we will pause. But we made it to part 3 of Unbroken. So keep up with us each day. Hope you're all doing well, washing your hands lots and all that. And I miss you. All right. That's it. See you tomorrow.